Welcome everybody on this Monday evening to this first of at least 3 videos that we call In Deep Conversation. Paula from Draw Your Book and I have read a second book. We read, as you might have seen, Vanessa Vasilka's novel The Great Offshore Grounds a couple of weeks ago, and we agreed to read a second book a little later, and this is Interior Chinatown by Charles Yu. When we decided to read this book, it was shortlisted for the National Book Award in the United States. And as you might know, about 2 weeks ago, almost 2 weeks ago, Charles Yu and Interior Chinatown was declared the winner of the National Book Award. So we were super excited that we were going to read the winner of the National Book Award. I have to say that this series, In Deep Conversation, is a series that was created by Sarah from Hardcover Hearts. I put a link down below to your channel in my video, and I'll also put a link to Paula's channel. Paula is going to answer this video. Here's how it works. I will present the book, Interior Chinatown, to you today, and I will end my first review, my first remarks of this book with 3 questions that I will ask Paula, and she will answer to those questions and will give me 3 questions that she would like me to answer, and this will be the 3rd video of In Deep Conversation about Charles Yu, Interior Chinatown. So now it's time, so let's get started. This is a novel that Charles Yu has written in a very strange kind of font. I'm going to show you the type of this book, and I hope that the camera can show it. So this is the way Interior Chinatown is written. It looks like a script of a play for theater, for stage, or a script for a movie, and this has a lot to do with movies. Charles Yu was born in 1976, in January 1976, so he is by now 44 years old, at the height of his creative power, winning the National Book Award. That is being on the height of your creative power. Charles Yu has written all his life, and he is a writer through and through. He is a screenplay writer, he is a writer of novels, he's a writer of short stories, he's a writer of articles, he's a journalistic writer. I recently, actually about 10 minutes before I started filming this video, I read an article by Charles Yu that he published in The Atlantic in April this year about the coronavirus and how it has changed He asks the question, what is fiction and what is reality? And this question, what is fiction and what is reality, is also a big part of this book. But Interior Chinatown by Charles Yu asks a lot of questions about which kind of stereotypes the American public has, but also the public in general in the so-called Western countries have about Asian people from Asia and people from China. The generic Asian man, I mean, that's Willis Wu. He's living in our time in Chinatown, somewhere in the United States. And his big dream, his fantasy is becoming the best thing he can become. Things is becoming Kung Fu guy, becoming a hero, the Kung Fu guy. Interior Chinatown is both a real story told in a screenplay, a story about the guy Willis Wu and his life, his parents, his family, the house that he lives in Chinatown, and it's also all of them are also part in a television show called Black and White, which is a show about 2 detectives, one black and one white detective. Sometimes when they solve their cases, they come to Chinatown, and sometimes cases happen in Chinatown. So Wu plays that, but all the roles, the possible roles for Chinese characters are always playing generic Asian man, or playing a young, beautiful Chinese woman, or playing old Chinese woman. So all of these Asian characters in Chinatown are living in one house. So Willis Wu is living on the 8th floor here in Chinatown, and he's like in a loop. Like all the action is somehow in a loop because history is repeating itself in interior Chinatown, and that's where the point where I thought this reminds me of a television show I have seen on HBO a few years back, and which I actually DNF'd, but in the second season, and that was Westworld. I don't know if you've seen it with Anthony Hopkins and a lot of other actors, but Hopkins is the lead star, and this is about a Western world where you can pay entrance for a lot of money. You can get into this West world that was created, where you can have sex with prostitutes, where you can shoot people in real, but all those prostitutes and all the people you shoot are at least robot people who are being repaired over the night and for the next day when the show begins again in Westworld, and all the things happen in a loop. And I thought this reminds me a little bit of Westworld, and actually I was super surprised, or not so surprised, when I found out that Charles Yu has been a writer for Westworld for season 2 and season 1, I think, a few years ago. So Charles Yu is also a scriptwriter for HBO, and his concept of being what is fiction, what is reality, seems to be a question that is always in his head and goes around in his head. That's Interior Chinatown. You see that in Westworld, in the TV series. You also see that in that essay that I mentioned before about the coronavirus in April that he wrote for The Atlantic, which I will link down below. In this essay, Charles asks the question, because we have so many strange words for this pandemic. It's unbelievable. It's unimaginable. Things like that. But it was imaginable because we sort of created the impression in our minds that this world was a very safe place. And as Charles Yu describes it in this essay, we sort of like to watch films about catastrophes, not only Jaws by Steven Spielberg, but also films about earthquakes, films about pandemics, films about science fiction films about the world being attacked and destroyed or on the brink of destruction. We watch them for 2 hours and then we go out of the cinema and we go into our real world. But which world is fiction? But because we never imagined that what we saw in cinema could be reality. And then this virus came and threatens our whole civilization, puts us into quarantine, changes our lives within a few weeks, crushes Wall Street and things like that. So what is fiction and what is reality? Fiction in the cinema when we watch those movies, but then we go out on the street and there's the virus everywhere. So fiction, what was fiction in our imagination, has become a reality for our lives. That's a part of that great essay that Charles Yu has written in April. And that's also a part of Interior Chinatown. What is reality? What is fiction? But also, of course, there is the big question of the Asian American people. Not for nothing, the TV series, the TV show that that Willis Wu is working in, is not starring in, but has a role as a generic Asian man. This TV series is called Black and White. So there's a lot of talk between the black and the white in the United States, the Afro-Americans and the Caucasians. And there's also a lot of story about brown people as well. But Asian Americans have sort of always been in the focus of American immigration policies. I didn't know that. When you read that book, pretty much in the end, there are some documents that Charles Yu is quoting that I had no idea that they actually existed. Exhibit number 2, Laws of the United States. 1943, the Chinese Exclusion Act is repealed by the Magnuson Act, and Chinese in the United States are given the right to become naturalized citizens, although ethnic Chinese in America was still prohibited from owning property or businesses. The quota for Chinese immigration is set to 105 people per year. First in 1965, the Immigration and Nationality Act is passed by the 89th United States Congress and signed into law by President Lyndon B. Johnson. Since the 19th century, the United States introduced a very discriminative law against Chinese people because they wanted to prevent cheap Chinese labor. That was the official cause, to to prevent cheap Chinese labor migrating to the United States. Chinese men were not allowed to come to the United States. Chinese women were not allowed to come to the United States for many, many decades. This was something that I didn't know anything about. I just asked myself, if they don't want Chinese people to dump prices for work, for labor in the United States, why don't they just install a minimum wage? That could have been the solution, but maybe they wouldn't think about it. Maybe this is communism. I don't know. There is so much racism against Asian Americans as well in the United States that it's really unbelievable. And especially after the SARS-CoV-2 virus came to the United States, even before it really hit the United States, President Trump called this virus the Chinese virus, the China virus. And this led actually to, he put kerosene into a fire. And many people were attacked by other Americans were attacked by other Americans because the color of their skin. Judy Chu, representative in Congress, has talked about that since the pandemic began, more than 100 attacks on Asian American people were executed each and every day in the United States. I also thought that this is not only about Asian Americans, because when I think of my own country, of Germany, we have a huge immigration we had a huge immigration, we still have it, from Turkey. I think 3 million people from Turkey live in Germany. And when you look at people in the film industry, for example, I actually know a very beautiful and wonderful actress, whose parents were born in Iran, and even she was born in Iran and moved to Germany when she was 2 years old. So she has very dark hair and brown eyes, and she was reduced to playing women with hijabs, women suppressed by their family, women in victimized roles, but never allowed to play just a wife, just a doctor, just a policewoman or something else. So a lot of our Turkish friends or Iranian friends or Iraqi friends were actually still reduced to play certain roles. Like when you are a man from Syria or Lebanon, you very often you can play a role like a pizza baker. You can play a role like a gangster in a Klan movie like Four Blocks, which was a TV show that was very popular in Germany in the last 2 years. But you're also reduced to a lot of roles. This is apparently and not very beautifully the fate of many immigrant groups, that if you look different, if you seem to be different, then the majority very often, very easily gives you a certain stereotypic role, and the picture of you is so so little and so poor actually that it never captures the whole of your culture, of your character, of your possibilities, and of your thriving and of your dreams. It always reduces you to such a little being, and how hurtful this must be for the minorities. This is also one thing that is really very clear in Charles Hughes' amazing novel Interior Chinatown. So there's so much to speak about, and also the film language, of course. He's a master. He knows the business. This guy knows about TV shows, about movies, and he knows how, and he loves this play with fiction and reality. And it also reminded me, of course, of the one big movie that Peter Carey starred in a couple of years ago, that was directed by the great Australian film director Peter Weir. And this is, of course, The Truman Show with Peter Carey, where the character Truman lives his life. He lives as a baby, he lives as a child, he grows up, he's a teenager, and then he grows up as a man. And then suddenly he realizes that all his life is fake, that all his life is actually a non-stop TV show that's going on. It was a magnificent idea by the people who did The Truman Show with Peter Carey, directed by Peter Weir. And also this feeling is somehow present in Interior Chinatown by Charles Yu. There is a lot of dialogue in this novel, Interior Chinatown, that is written like it is in a movie, like it's a screenplay for a movie. And the whole setting is very movie-like. And I really enjoyed this novel a lot. It was very easy to read it. It had a lot of angles, a lot of points where I think we can have a longer discussion about the situation of Asian American people, the situation of Chinese American people, and how those minorities are being looked at. I think that that is something we would have to ask Charles Yu, because I'm not living in the US, as I said. I was visiting both San Francisco in 2017. I was in Chinatown in 2017 for a couple of hours, and I also visited the city of Vancouver in Canada, British Columbia, in 2018, the year thereafter. And those of you who know Vancouver know that it's a very Asian North American city with lots of people from with Asian background. I counted actually in a book that I saw about restaurants in Vancouver. I counted 173 Japanese restaurants, and I think there are way more Chinese restaurants and even Korean restaurants in Vancouver. So a lot of people. We stayed in the house where most of the people who were living there in a house with, I think, 12 floors, and most of the people who were living there were Asian Canadians. So there's a lot of Asian representation in the Pacific Northwest and even in California. But I actually thought back to those moments when I was in Chinatown, where how Chinatown is established as sort of a cliche that of Chinese culture, and how difficult it is to get out of Chinatown, to get out of the role of generic Asian man, generic Asian woman. That is something that I didn't think about when I was there. So there's so much to talk about. I could go on for hours and hours. Charles Yu is a great author. He was actually named in 2007 already as 5 under 35 by the National Book Award Foundation. You know, every year the National Book Award Foundation asks 5 writers who have won the National Book Award, who were shortlisted or longlisted for the National Book Award, to give a name of a young aspiring author under 35 that they think is going to make his or her way into the Olymp of American literature. In 2007, he was actually chosen by Richard Powers. So now he came back 13 years later as the winner of this beautiful award. But now, I have said so much about this book that I really recommend it to you. But here are my questions for Paula, because this is a dialogue, and here are my questions for you, Paula. Some people were not so happy when Shuggie Bain won the Booker Prize in the United Kingdom, because they said it's a very conventional story. It's a heartwarming but very conventional story, and it did not bring literature into a new dimension. Knowing about this discussion, what do you think about Interior Chinatown? Is that also how unconventional is Interior Chinatown, and how did you like this filmish sort of style of the novel? Is it a novel, actually? Is Interior Chinatown a novel? What would you say? One of the things of Interior Chinatown is that the characters that are sort of reserved or sort of destined for Asian people in American popular culture are very superficial. And how would you describe, for example, Willis Wu, the main character of Interior Chinatown? You know more about him now. Would you also say that he's a superficial character, or does Charles Yu really succeed in making him a very strong and interesting character to you? And the final question, Paula, is obviously there are references to a lot of movies and works in this novel. What were your associations when you read it? because I'm a good bit older than you are, so you're much younger than I am. You come from a different part of Europe. We both are Europeans. What sort of associations did you get from reading this with all the stereotypes, and how did you grow up, and what do you remember of the stereotypes that were sort of confronted you when you were young, not so many years ago? And how would you connect them to the experience with this novel? This would be my 3 questions to you. This is the start of our in-deep conversation about this novel. I thank you so much for watching this video. Please follow the conversation, follow Paula's answers and her questions to me. That's all I have to say today. Thank you very much for watching this. Wear a mask, stay socially distant to people you don't live with, and see you soon on the other end of the coronavirus. Bye-bye.